So there will be a recording available to you. So today we're going to talk about the ways that we can make sure that we're providing equal access to all survivors of domestic and sexual violence to our victim services programs. Specifically today, we're going to talk about serving those survivors who have physical disabilities. So to start off with, I just want to take you through some laws related to serving those individuals with disabilities so that you know right off the bat, not only is making sure that we're providing complete and equitable services the right thing to do, but it's based in both state and federal law. So VAWA, VOCA, and FIPSA, all those great federal grant programs where you may receive funding for your program, as well as the Tennessee Family Violence Shelter State Standards, both say that, or all say, that people who meet the individual eligibility requirements for shelter or victim services should receive services regardless of disability. The 8 core services listed in the shelter standards must be provided for victims of family violence, regardless of the victim's disability status. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, those 8 core services that this is referring to are shelter, crisis hotline services, referral services, crisis counseling, victim advocacy, transportation, follow-up, and community education. So all of those core services related to shelter, related to crisis centers and advocacy must be provided to victims regardless of their disability status. So that is federal funding related to grants that you all receive. It's required. There are also federal laws requiring this. Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act talks about shelters. The ADA applies to all businesses and nonprofit service providers. They're referred to in this law as places of public accommodation. So nonprofit businesses, for-profit businesses. According to the ADA, public accommodations must provide goods and services in an integrated setting, eliminate unnecessary eligibility standards or rules that deny individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to enjoy goods and services, make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, and procedures that deny equal access to individuals with disabilities, furnish auxiliary aids when necessary to ensure effective communication unless an undue burden or fundamental alteration would result, remove architectural and structural barriers in existing facilities, provide, if you cannot, for some reason, remove those barriers, you have to provide alternative measures when removal of barriers is not readily achievable. Provide equivalent transportation service if that's something that you provide. Maintain accessible features of facilities and equipment. Design and construct new facilities and alter existing facilities in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So basically what that's saying is that you have to eliminate unnecessary barriers to access. So you have to make sure that your building is physically accessible, that your hotline is accessible through a TTY line or interpretation services, that you're modifying policies and practices that will make sure to provide equal access to individuals with disabilities. And we'll go into more detail as we go on about what some of those modifications may look like. This is also discussed in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as the Fair Housing Amendments Act. And these apply to most housing providers, including shelter and transitional living programs. The Fair Housing Act in particular prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, and national origin. This requires owners of housing facilities, which again includes shelters and transitional living programs, to make reasonable exceptions in their policies and operations to afford people with disabilities equal housing opportunities. So an example of that is a landlord with a no pets policy is required to grant exceptions that allow service animals into residences. So all of these federal laws, all of these mandates are requiring that we take steps to be sure that our programs are physically accessible and that individuals with disabilities can equally access our programs the same ways and with the same ease, hopefully, that any other survivor can access our programs. Individuals with disabilities are at an increased risk for experiencing sexual and domestic violence and other forms of abuse. This is due in large part to the increased vulnerability and dependence on caregivers and intimate partners that may be experienced by many people with disabilities. If you are more dependent than average on your caregiver or your partner, this is going to increase the potential to be subject to power and control tactics and abusive tactics. Also, it may take longer for people with disabilities to reach out for help than the average person, and many with disabilities experience multiple instances of abuse across their lifetime because of the increased vulnerability that they experience. So there are many factors that increase the likelihood that an individual with a disability will experience abuse. They include things like, again, relying on others to meet basic needs. The use of multiple caregivers can increase opportunities for sexual abuse. Social isolation results in limited exposure and lack of information about personal relationships and opportunities to disclose if abuse occurs. So if you already are isolated, then it again is much easier to perpetrate some of these power and control tactics, because we know that one of the biggest tactics of an abuser is using isolation. And if you're using, if you're using these tactics against somebody who's already experiencing some degree of isolation greater than that of the general public, then it is much easier to perpetrate these types of violence. People with cognitive disabilities may have a strong desire for friendship and connection and may be more easily convinced or coerced to forgive abuse or ignore abuse. The lack of social credibility for people with disabilities who report or disclose violence. So, there is still discrimination and bias against individuals who have disabilities. There's less credibility in general. As a society, we give them less autonomy, we give them less independence, and we see them oftentimes as more dependent, as less equal, which, as a whole means that we are feeding into the ability of abusers to take advantage of this social position, which is really why we have to think about destigmatizing disability in general and understanding that folks with disabilities are no less savvy and no less worthy and no less independent than those who do not experience disabilities. Other issues. Survivors that are deaf or have speech difficulties or a limited vocabulary may need communication devices or interpreters to assist with reporting or disclosing abuse. And especially in rural areas, access to these types of services are really difficult. And oftentimes you see abusers who actually position themselves as the victim's primary interpreter. So if the person who is abusing you is also the person who you are forced to rely on to communicate with the rest of the world for you, it puts you in an incredibly precarious and an incredibly vulnerable position. People with developmental disabilities may lack information about sexual abuse and safety strategies. Information about healthy and unhealthy relationships may not be taught in their special education classes or in institutions, and caregivers may not be providing this information. And oftentimes information about sexuality, healthy relationships, sexual abuse is not given to folks with developmental disabilities because we think we're protecting them from something that they can't understand. But the reality is we're not arming these individuals with the strategies and ways to keep themselves safe and to know what it is and isn't okay with regards to relationships and social interaction and friendship even. And generally, whether it is a cognitive disability or a physical disability, society is still very uncomfortable with people with disabilities having intimate relationships and thinking about those parts of their lives. And so as a society, we're likely to deny that people can be abused or victimized by an intimate partner because we are more likely to deny that they even have an intimate partner. The large number of people with disabilities in institutional settings and the physical and emotional contact of caregivers results in really severe power imbalances between staff and residents. This increases the risk for physical and sexual abuse and exploitation. So all of these things really impact the ability of folks with various disabilities to either seek safety or seek an end to their abuse, report their abuse, or even understand the abuse that's happening to them in the same way that someone who has been taught about healthy relationships might. So how do we make sure that we are serving folks appropriately, right? So when you have someone who calls you for first contact, intake, eligibility into services, when somebody is first contacting you, first calling you, advocates should use this moment to determine if the client is eligible for services based on their abuse history alone. Sorry about that. Eligibility is based on whether they are experiencing violence or whether they have experienced violence and need advocacy services or need shelter services. We should determine this eligibility based on abuse history and communicate the eligibility to them. Yes, you're eligible for services. Yes, we have bed space open. Yes, let's figure out how to get you here. Yes, you qualify for advocacy services, whatever it is, before talking to a survivor about accessibility needs. Use this time to learn about survivors' primary needs. As with any other survivor, immediate safety is the first priority when advocates make initial contact. Advocates should determine if a client is eligible for services based, again, on their abuse history. It is mandatory that if any questions about disability are asked, they must be asked of all clients. This allows programs to avoid discrimination in their services. And again, the laws are very clear. The presence of a disability cannot determine a survivor's access to service. Advocates should also note that probing for more information or asking for proof of a disability is prohibited. It's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act to require documentation or medical information or to try to confirm a person's disability status in that way. If one client, so if you're questioning one client, you should ask the same questions to all clients. And you're not a detective. You don't need to ask for proof. And by law, you should not be asking for proof. If you're asking questions about disability, those questions should be used as a guide to make sure that your services are accessible. Advocates should use information to improve accessibility and improve accommodations or provide what accommodations are needed. If an agency decides they want to develop questions about disability-related needs, they should be questions that help identify barriers to service and overcome them, help identify resources, help survivors understand how disability affects the violence they've experienced, determine availability of support, and addresses issues related to support system, things like safety planning, and above all, maintain survivors' privacy, confidentiality, and autonomy. So again, as with any survivor who contacts you, the first step is determining safety and eligibility based on their abuse status. And the next steps then may be talking about accessibility and making sure the client has what they need to succeed and live and access services. But that is the same with all clients. You should be making sure that all clients have what they need to access services. And access includes things like when you're making a plan to bring clients into shelter and you're considering access, think about adaptive equipment that they may need, not just their wheelchair or crutches or mobility devices, but also, what kinds of baths or showers can they access? Do you need a shower bench? Do you need different kinds of shower heads that help them to bathe? Do they have communication devices or need access to communication devices? Do they need access to translation or interpretation services? Do they need access to medication? Do they have service animals, a service animal that they're bringing in? Do they work with home health agencies or have home health caseworkers that are already coordinating or can assist in coordinating services that they might need? Do they have family members who help them care or deal with personal tasks? Do they need their medical records, or do they have regularly set appointments with doctors that they have to go to related to their disability or medical needs. All of these things are not related to someone's eligibility for service. They are not related to someone's ability and need for shelter. What they are related to is the way that we help make sure that they can access shelter in the best possible way. Just the same way that someone who maybe come into shelter who is pregnant may need to access certain medications or have ongoing doctor's appointments, the same way that anyone else may have very specific needs related to, their bodies, their cultures, their lived experiences. Be careful that you're not making assumptions based on appearance or communication. A person's disability may be more or less severe than it seems, and there are many times where individuals have what is called an invisible disability, where it is not readily apparent by looking at them that they may have mobility issues or a pain disorder or cognitive or learning disabilities that are not readily apparent. So don't make judgments based on someone's appearance. And that's, something that we should all be doing with every client. Talk directly to the survivor, not the care provider, not the case manager, not the family member, not the social worker, not the interpreter. Talk to the survivor. And this is true also when you're working with a survivor who may not speak English and may need a translator. You still want to be talking directly to that survivor because they are your client. Involve parents, caregivers, service providers, etc., only if a survivor gives full consent. Consent and confidentiality are important for all survivors, regardless of their disability status or needs. When you're working with a survivor with disabilities, they may be kind of guarded, for lack of a better term, by family members or service providers who sometimes walk a fine line between the wishes of the client and the wishes of the family member. And so remember that the survivor is your focus. The survivor is your client. Take notice of any person who answers for the survivor or who may not leave the survivor, who doesn't want to communicate, who doesn't want you communicating directly with the survivor, because this is, a warning sign of some controlling and abusive behavior. People with cognitive disabilities may take longer to process feelings and information, and it may take additional time for things like intake and case management. So just be aware of that. Take your cues from the survivor. Support survivors in making decisions and choices as you would any other survivor. And keep in mind that living a stereotypically normal life doesn't make a person with a disability extraordinary or heroic or special, and treating someone with a disability as if they are somehow heroic for being independent and living their own life is, it's really very condescending and rude. Remember that all standard rules of confidentiality apply when serving with a person with a disability, just as it would serving any other client. Staff must get signed releases before talking about the case with family members, service providers, home health aides, etc., etc. The survivor is the client. Often you'll see care providers or family members or others that expect that you will automatically just give them information about the survivor because, I care for them or I, help them on a day-to-day, so you should tell me what I want to know. But unless a client has a cognitive disability where they have a legal guardian the way that a minor might, and in which case confidentiality rules are a little bit different. But if that is not the case, you have somebody who just may have home health aides or may have other care providers who are not their legal guardian and they don't need a legal guardian, then advocates should always defer to the client's wishes about confidentiality and the client's permissions, as they do with every other client. Shelters are required to make reasonable physical modifications to the premises to allow people with disabilities to access their program and resources. This includes service animals. All of the laws that we already talked about at the beginning of the webinar also require shelters to allow service animals on premises. Shelters must modify any no animals policies and practices as needed to allow equal access to shelter for any persons with a disability who are using a service animal. Believing survivors when they tell you that an animal is a service animal complies with federal and state law and is a best practice. You do not need documentation that an animal is a service animal. In fact, it is against the law to require an individual to present you with documentation as proof of their disability or for their service animal. There are 2 questions that you are allowed by law to ask regarding service animals. You can ask, is this a service animal? And you can ask, what tasks is this animal trained to perform? Again, you cannot require documentation. So, there are some frequently asked questions that we get a lot around service animals within shelter. And so I want to go through a few of those. Number 1, can we keep service animals out of common areas like kitchens? The answer to that is absolutely no. No, you cannot. When a service animal is working, they must always accompany their owners. When you limit where the animal can go, you are also limiting where the survivor can go. Question number 2, can staff or other residents interact with a service animal? Examples, petting the animal, feeding the animal, and talking to the animal. Again, the answer is no. When the service animal is working, it needs its entire focus to do its job. That means no staff or other residents should ever touch, speak to, feed, or otherwise interact with the animal while it is working. If you're not sure if the animal is working, ask its owner. Always ask the animal's owner before interacting with the animal, even if it's not working. Is the shelter responsible for providing the animal's food or care? Generally, the animal's owner is responsible for all feeding and care and cleanup unless prohibited by their disability. And the associated costs with things like feeding and care. If the survivor is unable to pay for food and other supplies, the shelter should help when able or assist the survivor in seeking help from community agencies. What if another resident is allergic to or afraid of the service animal? So you have a resident in shelter, you're bringing in someone who has a service animal, and the first resident is either afraid of the animal or they're highly allergic to the animal. So legally, allergies or aversions or fears are not acceptable reasons for limiting shelter access to a survivor and their service animal. Shelters should work to provide reasonable accommodations to all survivors. And the American Disability Act gives a very clear guidance on this, that advocates working to find accommodations that if you have someone who is afraid of the animal, or if you have someone with allergies, you should work to find that person, the person who is afraid or the person who is allergic, accommodations in another shelter. You should work to rehouse the allergic/afraid person, okay? You should not allow that person's fear or allergy to affect your acceptance of the survivor and their service animal. So I'm going to go through a few kind of ideas around thinking about your agency and whether or not your agency is accessible. And when I send out the slides and the information from this webinar, I am also going to send out a complete agency assessment that has a checklist and some ideas that you can use to go around your physical agency and really assess how you're doing in terms of being accessible to clients with disabilities. So you will get a further resource that will allow you to do an assessment on your own. But first, the agency's client non-discrimination policy specifically includes disability status. So go ahead in your chat or question box if you feel comfortable and let me know if your agency has this in place. Most agencies have a Title VI policy, but do you know if your non-discrimination policy specifically talks about disability status? I'll give you a second to answer. Okay, we have a couple people who've said yes, their discrimination policy does include disability status. That's wonderful. I encourage you all, if you don't know, to check your policies and procedures and see if that is included. Your agency actively collaborates with local disability or deaf organizations to assure survivors have access to a complete range of services. So who of you are doing that, or do you know if your agency is partnering with or collaborating with disability organizations, or are you aware of disability organizations in your community that you can partner with or can refer clients to? And the next question is, your agency provides auxiliary aids and accommodations to people with disabilities when requested. So this may be, again, things like a shower bench, or a handheld shower head. This may be things like making sure you have a sign language interpreter on hand if it's needed, or a TTY phone or things like that. Do you all have those accommodations within your agencies? Remember that you have a chat box on your little toolbar where you can answer if you feel so inclined. Your agency has undergone physical modifications to make it accessible to wheelchair-bound survivors or other survivors with mobility issues. So you have ramps, your doorways are wide enough, your hallways are wide enough to make sure that people can access. You have wheelchair accessible restrooms and bars in the restrooms to help with mobility access. Do you all have those accessibility points? So the last one that I've got on here is the agency provides sign language interpretation and or TTY service along with its other language services. So thinking about these things, and again, I will also send you the complete assessment that has many more questions and ideas on it, so that you can look into making sure that your agency is being thoughtful about accessibility and that you're providing complete equitable services to survivors with disabilities. So I will send that along to you when you receive, your certificate and the copy of the slides as well. And so here are just some resources. Again, you will get copies of these slides, so you will have all of these amazing resources. But I particularly want to draw your attention to the Tennessee Disability Coalition. This is an amazing organization in the state that provides a lot of resources and services and advocacy for folks with disabilities to make sure that they are receiving the resources and care and treatment and and empowerment and respect that they need. So I think that's an amazing resource for any of your agencies to be aware of. So that wraps us up for today. Does anybody have any questions? I've given you a lot, I hope, to think about and talk about, and hopefully you all are already aware of some of the great things that you're doing within your organizations to make sure you're accessible. But do you have any questions for me about what we've talked about today before we wrap up? Should a comfort pet be considered the same as a service animal? They are not the same. So a pet is not the same as a service animal. A service animal is highly, highly trained to perform very specific functions. Those functions can be guidance functions for folks who have vision impairments. They can be things like, service animals provided for those who maybe experience severe symptoms of autism. A lot of service animals are now being trained to work with folks who have very severe diabetes around their, being able to detect insulin levels. Folks with seizure disorders have service animals who can be trained to detect potential seizures and also to protect their owner's physical body if they're having a seizure. There are service animals who are trained to work with folks who have severe PTSD. So service animals are trained for very intensive and specific roles. There are things like comfort animals or therapy animals, which are and can be incredibly helpful to folks who have experienced trauma, but are not trained in the same ways that service animals are trained, and so they are not necessarily protected under the laws the way that service animals are. But it's, again, we can't ask for documentation and proof. We can just ask, is it a service animal, and what is it trained, what services is it trained to provide? And the reason for asking about services is so that we can kind of have a heads up of what we may need to do or look for to also help and protect this client. Other questions? Yes, if a client is receiving home health care, is it okay for the nurse or physical therapist to come to the shelter? Absolutely. It is absolutely okay. You do need to have them sign a confidentiality agreement as you would any other visitor into your shelter, but it is absolutely okay. And in fact, it is recommended that if you have a client who is receiving home health care, that they are able to continue receiving their physical therapy or whatever type of care while they're in shelter. That's part of them being able to access shelter and be healthy while they're in shelter. Anything else? All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you again for attending. Like I said, I will send out those resources this afternoon. I appreciate all of you. If you do have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know, and I will do my very best to either answer those for you or point you in the right direction. When you close out of the webinar, I just want you to know that there will be an evaluation, a little survey that pops up. And these are records that we keep and need for our grant funding. So if you do have time and you are so inclined, it would be wonderful if you would fill out that little survey for us. There is also a spot on the survey where you can list folks who may have attended the webinar with you, because I know oftentimes we may have one person register and several colleagues may kind of all view the webinar all together in one office. So that allows us to have a really complete record of all the folks who attended so that everybody can get that credit. So I appreciate you. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.